So what we get here at this point is the obvious question, who invented knocking on wood for good luck? Who's the Hindu who had some sort of obsession with the number 24, or the Jew with an obsession with the number 18? Who got this belief that God was completely obsessed with the numbers of bones in the body, and that's how many things you should do? What we have here is not only the recognition that if you are OCD, religion can provide a sanctuary. If you are OCD in the right setting, you can in fact make a living by being religiously ritualistic, but the recognition that probably people with strong obsessive compulsive tendencies had something to do with the invention of many of these rituals. I suspect historically that's where it has come from. So that brings up the issue that was brought up before. Why should these rituals be so similar? You look at the prohibitions, for example, in Judaism, more than 200 of these have to do with food preparation and cleansing. You see the sequence in any of these, and the top 4 in OCD are identical to the top 4 in all of these religions: cleansing of the body, food preparation, entering and leaving significant religious places, and numerology, numbers. Why should that be? Basically, 2 types of explanations. One is we may be seeing some sort of convergence. It's not by chance that people are highly ritualistically concerned with making sure their bodies are cleaned and that their food is correctly prepared, and I suspect that has part to do with it. But I suspect what we're also seeing, and with records of people like Martin Luther, what we're also seeing is because some of the people who invented some of these religious rituals had a background of OCD. Maybe not fully paralytic versions, but nonetheless, somebody spending 5 hours a day washing his hands and 5 hours a day confessing about how he didn't wash his hands enough, this does not seem to be a mild version. The more I wash, the dirtier I get. Okay, what I think you wind up seeing is that historically, all sorts of folks generating rituals. OCD is estimated to have an incidence anywhere from 1 to 10% in the population, depending on how you define it, the continuum. And what you have is, I suspect, in periods of religious crisis, cultural crisis, during a period of persecution, during a period where whatever is currently in shape is not working, the right person at the right moment comes forward and in effect says, this is how I have been privately honoring our Lord all these years, and I am offering it to all of you to see this is what I have been doing, and in the right place and time, it catches on and it turns into the thing that is the ritual for the rest of the community within decades. Okay. So what I've been suggesting here, and what I also emphasize, is none of this is original with me except for the notion that the OCD has something to do with the invention of these rituals. These ideas go back decades, go back centuries, that there is a parallelism between the symptoms of what we call schizotypalism and the metamagical backbone of religious theology. There's a parallelism between what we call obsessive-compulsive disorder and the ritualism of mainstream Orthodox religion, and this key point that the exact same behaviors, which in one context destroys your life, has you peripheralized. Do it right, do it in the right context, and it is not peripheralizing, it makes you very honored and powerful. One of the healthiest things you could do with your life is to be religious. And to be highly religious, it is a very strong protector against major depression. Religious belief extends your life expectancy, and that's after you control for, it changes risk factors, you're less likely to drink to excess, all of that. What is the big issue in that field is, do the health benefits of religiosity merely come from the social community that you get typically by being religious? The question early in the lecture today, religiosity versus spirituality, that might be a realm to dissociate them. Spirituality, if it's a very personal one, you wouldn't get the community. Do you still get the health benefits? Nobody knows at this point, but those are studies that people are doing. But absolutely, one of the greatest things you can do out there to buffer yourself from depression is to be religiously believing. And walk through all the steps at the end of the lecture the other day, elements of control, predictability, explanation, outlet, and you will see exactly how religion taps into that. And to go back to the question that came up here before, why do we have a societal need for shamans? Why do we have a societal need for much of this? Because we are trying to explain the unexplainable. We are trying trying to look for causal links of things that may or may not be associated. This is basically a way of describing superstition. How tight of a link do you need between cause and effect to believe that there has been cause and effect? And this is coming down to statistical relations. And if you allow yourself to believe that this prayer could be answered, but it wasn't this time because I wasn't concentrating enough, I need to do it a bit more fervently, all of that, you have a system that allows us very readily to see causal links that may not be there. Now, what is the next interesting neurobiological piece of this is that take animals, take rats, and damage their hippocampus. And what you get with hippocampal damage then is you have more trouble making causal sequential links in events. What you wind up seeing, and this next sentence is meant to be as provocative as it will sound, is when you have rats with hippocampal damage, they are more vulnerable to superstitious conditioning. Essentially what that is saying is that as you have a damaged hippocampus, you have less of a capacity to tell the difference between accurate cause and effect linkages and ones that are merely statistically hinting of that, or ones that may not be in the slightest bit connected with each other. Hippocampal damage and rats have a lower threshold for superstitious conditioning. And we can very readily run with that one in terms of what the implications of that might be, going our usual sequence from, in order to appreciate a biological effect, big, gross lesion sort of stuff, to once again the much more subtle realm. We all differ in our number of hippocampal neurons and the amount of this enzyme and the amount of myelin and all the biology we know, all the individual differences. A last disorder that winds up being interesting. There is a type of epilepsy which, when you have it, something happens to your religious belief system. And this is one of its characteristic features. Epileptic seizures, as I think we've discussed in here, have characteristics as to what part of the brain they originate in. And this is epilepsy that originates in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe containing the hippocampus, the amygdala. It's a big limbic area. The temporal lobe epilepsy. And about 30 years ago, a neurologist named Geschwin, who was at Harvard, who was probably the most influential neurologist of the 20th century, Geschwin published a paper first describing what is now called temporal lobe personality, which is a cluster of personality traits that become far more common in people with temporal lobe epilepsy. Once again, not everybody with this personality profile has epilepsy lurking there. Not everybody with temporal lobe epilepsy gets this profile, but statistically at a higher than expected rate. What do you see with temporal lobe personality? First off, the person becomes extremely serious and humorless. Okay, you might say, I would become extremely serious and humorless if I suddenly came down with epilepsy. What's the appropriate control? Looking at other types of epilepsies of equivalent severity, it's specific to temporal lobe. So you get the seriousness. Next thing you get is what is termed neophobia. You don't like new things. You like to just do very familiar sorts of stuff, the same small circle of friends, the same very relatively limited range of experiences. Okay, if I had epilepsy, I would suddenly get a lot more sort of involuted in my lifestyle. Once again, the controls are other types of epilepsies. Next thing you see is this bizarre trait called hypergraphia, which is people with temporal lobe personality begin to write obsessively. They feel a pressured need to write. Fourth trait, and the most interesting one of all, is people with temporal lobe personality become obsessively interested in religious and philosophical subjects. And these are not people with uncontrolled seizures happening all the time. These are people whose seizures are relatively well controlled with medication. And there's even been a paper published in a neurology journal doing this sort of paleoforensic neurology by a neurologist speculating someone who in history had temporal lobe epilepsy, and this was St. Paul. St. Paul, who had seizure auras, as documented. No evidence that the guy was particularly humorous. The guy was hypergraphic as hell, and clearly had a very strong interest in religious and philosophical subjects. And, you know, this is fun, but what do you make of the fact that somebody has an uncontrolled seizure in this part of the brain for 30 seconds once every 6 months, and they become more interested in religious subjects? What I'm saying is, it is absolutely fascinating that the same exact traits which in a secular context are life-destroying, separate you from a community, and in the right setting are at the very core of what is protected, what is sanctioned, what is rewarded, what is valued in religious settings so often, and that there could be an underlying biology to